Welcome to the deep dive. You know that feeling? You're in a safety training session, and it all makes sense, seems really useful.
Hmm.
But then you get back to the actual job, and somehow it just doesn't quite connect. Or maybe it fades away.
Yeah, totally. It's like the knowledge just evaporates, like you said.
Yeah.
That's what we're digging into today, this training transfer problem.
Exactly. And it's not simply about people forgetting stuff. It goes deeper, right? It's about whether what you learn in, say, a classroom or online actually fits the reality of your work. The messy, complex day-to-day stuff.
Precisely. It's like learning fancy spreadsheet tricks in a course, but then your work computer doesn't even have the right software version,
Mm.
or your boss wants reports done a completely different way.
Good analogy. The training doesn't transfer because the context is wrong.
Exactly. Same principle applies to safety.
So, to really get under the skin of this, we're focusing on a study called Safety Training in Context. And what's really interesting, I think, is its angle. It doesn't just look at learning styles or, the latest training gadget. It frames the whole problem as one of fit.
Fit. Okay.
Yeah, how well does the training actually align with all the different pieces of your real work environment?
Right. And to figure that out, the researchers did something smart. They went straight to the source.
The trainers themselves.
Exactly. They interviewed 12 health and safety trainers. And these were people fresh out of college.
Yeah.
These were seasoned professionals.
Okay.
We're talking over a decade of hands-on experience, minimum. And crucially, experience across at least 2 different industries each, plus international exposure.
Wow, okay. So a really broad perspective. What kind of industries are we talking about? Stuff people listening might recognize.
So definitely, you've got your high-risk sectors like construction, oil and gas, nuclear, but also manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, transport, telecoms,
Even entertainment.
entertainment.
That's
Interesting. Yeah, unique challenges there too, apparently. And these people weren't just trainers, they held pretty senior roles. Academics, consultants, directors, key figures in industry bodies.
So they've seen it from multiple angles.
Absolutely. And from different places too, UK, US, Australia, the Netherlands,
Mhm.
Malaysia. So it's a proper global high-level view from people designing and delivering this stuff.
You're getting that real boots on the ground insight, but also the strategic view.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
They know what tends to work, what obstacles keep cropping up when you try to get safety ideas embedded in different types of organizations. The study really captures their collective insights on why training sometimes, well, misses the mark for the people actually doing the work.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear then. We want to understand why safety training sometimes seems to fall flat when it hits the real world.
Hmm.
We'll try to unpack those key factors, the technical stuff, the cultural norms, maybe even the political dynamics that affect this fit between the training and your specific job. The goal is to give everyone listening maybe a new way to think about safety learning where they work.
Sounds good.
All right. So the study itself, where did the researchers start? How did they frame this investigation?
Well, interestingly, they started by digging into why organizations do safety training in the first place.
Mm.
What's the motivation?
Okay. Makes sense.
And the trainers they spoke to basically highlighted 2 main drivers. First off, a lot of training happens because of external pressures.
Like new laws or regulations.
Exactly. New legislation comes in, standards get updated,
Mm-hmm.
and training is often the go-to response to show, yep, we're compliant, our people know about this.
Right. Ticking the box, meeting legal requirements. I think the study mentioned things like responding to audits or improvement notices too.
That's it.
Yeah.
There's often a clear external push, and training looks like a direct, visible action. Have you seen that happen?
Oh, definitely. It's a tangible thing management can point to.
Yeah. And the trainers, well, some felt that sometimes the act of training itself almost becomes the end goal.
Rather than the actual safety improvement.
Kind of. It's a way for the organization to demonstrate due diligence, maybe to regulators or insurers, even if that specific training wasn't necessarily the most effective fix for the underlying safety issue. It's about showing action was taken.
That's a slightly cynical take, but probably true in some cases. Okay, what was the second main driver they found?
The second big reason was internally driven needs. So this wasn't about reacting to outside pressure.
More proactive.
Sometimes it could come from analyzing their own safety data, maybe seeing a rise in certain incidents. Or interestingly, sometimes it was just a general feeling, a sense within the company that, we need to up our game on safety.
I can picture that, a sort of cultural shift maybe, or just an awareness that things aren't quite right.
Could be. But this study also pointed out a potential pitfall here.
Oh.
Sometimes these internally driven initiatives get rolled out really fast. Maybe a top leader mandates something after an incident,
Right, a knee-jerk reaction.
potentially. And without maybe fully thinking through if training is the best answer or how it'll actually work in practice across different parts of the business.
Ah, so the fit issue again.
Exactly. One trader gave an example. A senior manager ordered a new safety procedure for all sites after one incident, but didn't really consider if it made sense everywhere, given different equipment or workflows.
So it looks good from the top, but doesn't work on the ground for the people doing the job.
That's the risk. On the flip side, though, the trainers noticed that when safety initiatives, including training, came more from the bottom up,
Involving the employees.
yeah, involving the people actually doing the work and figuring out the problems and solutions, well, then you typically got much better buy-in. The training felt more relevant, more useful to them.
That makes total sense. If you help shape the solution, you're more invested in making it work.
Huh.
Okay, so we know why training happens, but the core idea here is this fit with the workplace context. How did the study look at when or if context actually gets considered when training is designed or delivered?
Right. This was key. The trainers were pretty much unanimous. Context is absolutely crucial if you want training to actually stick and lead to safer work.
So how does it get factored in? Or does it?
Well, they identified two main points where it can happen. The first is right at the start, when the training is being designed.
Before anyone's even in a classroom. So thinking about the specific workplace, the tools, the procedures, the culture beforehand.
Exactly. Some trainers talked about actively working with the client organization, maybe getting their senior safety people to review the syllabus, the content.
Like a quality check for relevance.
Yeah, precisely. Making sure it addresses their specific hazards, their ways of working. That approval step can be really important for ensuring that initial fit.
That sounds like a good practice. But you also see a lot of standardized, off-the-shelf training, right? What did the trainers say about that?
They did. And look, standardized training isn't all bad. It can ensure a certain baseline quality, consistency,
And probably cheaper sometimes.
often, yeah, more cost effective. But the big drawback they flagged is that this one-size-fits-all model often just doesn't account for the unique context.
Different companies, different risks, different cultures.
Right, different hazards, different existing procedures, maybe even different types of workers. And sometimes the person choosing the training might not fully grasp the training content or the specific work environment it's going into.
So they might just pick the cheapest option, not the best fit.
That's the concern. Efficiency might trump effectiveness, basically.
Okay, so design is one stage. What about the actual delivery? When the training is happening, how does context come in then?
This is where a really good trainer can make a huge difference.
How so?
In a classroom, skilled trainers will often try to pull out the real-world experiences of the people in the room.
Make it relevant to them.
Exactly. Or they'll share examples, maybe anonymized case studies, that resonate with the kind of work the participants do. Especially in open courses with people from different companies, you get a natural mix of contexts being discussed.
Sharing the war stories, as they sometimes call them.
Yeah. Those lived experiences can be incredibly powerful learning tools, even within a single company's training session. You've probably experienced that, right? Learning more from a colleague's story than a PowerPoint slide.
Oh, absolutely. It makes it real, connects the theory to actual situations you might face. And the study mentioned asking questions, discussions.
Crucial. The chance for participants to ask, but what about in my situation? Or how would this work with our equipment? That's vital for applying the knowledge later.
And that's maybe a downside of purely online, self-paced stuff.
That's what they highlighted. You lose that real-time interaction, the ability to get immediate clarification tailored to your specific context.
Makes sense. You mentioned case studies earlier. How do they help bring context into the delivery?
Good case studies, the trainer said, don't just describe an incident, they unpack the whole chain of events leading up to it.
The why behind the what.
Exactly. They let participants explore how different factors, technical, human, organizational, might have played a role. It encourages that deeper thinking about how safety principles apply in messy, real-world scenarios that might feel familiar.
Okay, so there are ways to build context in, both in design and delivery, but did the trainers feel it was happening enough or systematically?
That was a definite point of frustration, actually.
Oh.
Despite everyone agreeing context is vital for making training work, many trainers felt it often gets overlooked or just sort of assumed.
Assumed, how do you mean?
Assumed that people will automatically figure out how to apply the general principles to their specific job, their specific environment. There was a sense that maybe organizations don't always fully appreciate just how much this specific workplace reality shapes safety outcomes.
Right. They focus on delivering the information, but not enough on bridging that gap to the actual workplace.
That seems to be the feeling. It's not always given the deliberate attention it needs.
Okay. So fit is crucial, context often overlooked. This brings us to the real core of the study then. What are these contextual factors that matter so much? The study broke them down into technical, cultural, and political factors, right? Operating at different levels.
That's the framework they developed. Technical, cultural, political, influencing things at the individual level, the organizational level, and even beyond the organization itself.
Let's start with the technical ones. What did the trainers point to there? What affects you as an individual worker?
Okay, so individual technical factors. This includes your existing knowledge and skills, obviously, your general competence, but not just for frontline workers, for managers too.
So knowing how to do the job safely.
Yes, but also having the practical ability, maybe even the physical capability, to actually do the safety actions required by the training. And things like your level of education can play a role, plus psychosocial factors.
Like morale, feeling stressed or resentful.
Exactly. Morale, resentment,
Hmm.
those feelings can definitely impact how diligently someone follows safety procedures, even if they understand them perfectly well. You can see how low morale might make someone cut corners, right?
Absolutely. If you feel the company doesn't care about you, why bother going the extra mile for their safety rules? Okay, what about technical factors at the wider organizational level?
Here, things like the company's size and its industry sector make a difference. Small businesses might use simpler safety systems, while a big multinational has the challenge of keeping things consistent across very different sites.
Public sector versus private sector too, I imagine. Different pressures.
Definitely. Different processes, different priorities. And a really key technical point the trainers raised was how safety interventions are often designed separately from the actual day-to-day workflow.
Ah, so the new safety step feels like an add-on, an extra burden.
Precisely. It creates extra workload, makes
Hmm.
it harder to integrate the new procedure smoothly, and that really hinders people adopting it long term. If it doesn't fit easily into how you already work, it's less likely to stick.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, and then there were technical factors outside the organization, super-organizational.
Yeah. These are things beyond the company's direct control.
Yeah.
The big one is the regulatory environment, the laws and standards in that region or country. That sets the baseline.
Industry standards too.
And chasing external certifications, like ISO standards. That can drive certain safety behaviors, sometimes maybe even overshadowing other safety issues more relevant to that specific workplace.
Interesting. What else?
Things like the prevailing business models in a sector can affect how many resources are actually available for safety. And even geography matters.
How so?
Well, for example, in some less developed countries, basic public health issues might, quite understandably, be a much bigger priority than something like workplace mental health,
Hmm.
which might get more focus elsewhere.
Right. It puts workplace safety into a broader societal context. Okay, that covers the technical side. Fascinating how many layers there are. Let's shift to cultural factors. How does the company culture affect safety training sticking?
Culture is huge, as you'd expect. At the individual level, thinking about your direct experience at work, the commitment and support of your immediate manager is massive.
More than senior leadership, maybe?
Well, you need senior leadership buy-in,
Yeah.
absolutely. But if your direct boss doesn't get it or doesn't reinforce it, the message from the top gets diluted pretty quickly. Middle management can be a real bottleneck.
And the manager needs to know what they're talking about, too.
Yes, they need some technical competence, an understanding of the work their team actually does, and also what gets measured gets managed, right?
The metrics.
Yeah. What safety metrics the organization focuses on really signals what's considered important. Is it just counting accidents after they happen, or are they looking at proactive things? What gets emphasized where you work?
Good question. If it's all about lost time injuries, maybe people are less likely to report near misses, even though that's really valuable information. Okay, organizational level culture.
This was unanimous among the trainers. The overall organizational culture is probably the single biggest factor. Does the company really value safety?
Beyond just saying it does.
Exactly. Is it just aiming for minimum legal compliance? Or is it genuinely striving for best practice? And a huge part of that is psychological safety.
Meaning people feel safe to speak up.
Yes. Can you raise a safety concern without fearing you'll be blamed, sidelined, or punished? The trainers had a powerful example for this.
What was that?
They said a real acid test of a positive safety culture is, has anyone in the organization ever stopped production because of a safety concern and been fully supported, even praised for doing it?
Wow, that is a litmus test, isn't it? Shows if safety truly trumps production pressure when push comes to shove. Have you ever seen that happen?
It's rare, but incredibly powerful when it does.
Okay. And culture isn't just inside the company walls, is it? What about those supra-organizational cultural influences?
Right. National culture plays a big role. People's underlying beliefs, their attitudes towards risk, towards authority, that's all shaped by the wider society they live in.
So what's seen as an acceptable risk can vary hugely.
Massively.
Yeah.
And trying to implement a certain safety rule might clash with deeply ingrained cultural norms. The study had that striking example.
The lorries and buses.
Yeah, trying to enforce strict rules about not riding on flatbed lorries might seem pointless or impractical in a place where people routinely ride on the roof of a bus just to get around.
It shows safety isn't universal in quite the way we sometimes think. It's filtered through local culture.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that you can't just import a safety system wholesale. You have to understand the local values and beliefs.
Okay, technical cultural. Now the third category, which maybe sounds a bit surprising, political factors. What do they mean by political in this context?
Yeah, it's not politics like elections. It's about the power dynamics, the competing agendas, the internal relationships within and around the organization that can help or hinder safety efforts.
Ah, office politics, but broader, affecting safety.
Kind of. So at the individual level, the personal beliefs and values of senior leaders about safety are critical. It's not just policy, it's their visible commitment. Do they walk the talk?
Do they show up for safety briefings? Do they ask about safety on site visits?
Exactly. That active engagement sends a powerful political message. Conversely, if there's a perception that the top brass don't really care, it undermines everything, no matter how good the training is. Have you ever seen that disconnect?
I think most people have seen variations of that, sadly, where the official line is safety first, but the real pressure is all about production targets.
Right. So that leadership buy-in has a real political weight. How resources get allocated, what gets prioritized, who gets held accountable.
Okay. What about political factors at the organizational level?
Here, the study pointed to relationships between different groups, maybe friction between head office and remote sites.
Us versus them.
Could be. Or conflicts between departments' production versus maintenance, for instance, or even between different professional groups. These internal conflicts and competing priorities can seriously get in the way of implementing safety practices consistently.
Things people learn in training just get lost in the crossfire.
Potentially.
Huh?
Employee relations in general fit here too. Is there trust between management and workers? Can people communicate openly? And the presence or absence of unions can be a big political factor too, influencing how safety issues are negotiated and addressed.
So internal power struggles and relationships can create real roadblocks, even if the training itself is fine. And finally, super-organizational politics. Influences from outside.
These are the political forces beyond the company's gates. Local laws, again, are a big one. They're a political outcome, really, dictating standards.
Right.
Then you have the complexities for international companies. If safety laws are much weaker in one country than another, what do? Apply the higher standard everywhere. Or just meet the local minimum. That's an ethical and a political decision.
I can see that.
The study also mentioned different government attitudes towards health and safety. They used the example of drug and alcohol testing.
How approaches vary.
Yeah, across Europe, for example. Some countries might have policies leaning towards punishment, others more towards support and rehabilitation. That reflects different political and social philosophies.
Okay. Anything else?
One last interesting one. How much safety information gets shared between organizations in the same sector?
Like learning from each other's mistakes. Or successes.
Exactly. Some industries, like aviation, have a strong culture of sharing incident data and lessons learned. That's partly a political choice, a collaborative approach. Other sectors might be much more competitive, more siloed, less willing to share.
Wow. Okay. It's genuinely eye-opening when you lay it all out like that. Technical, cultural, and political factors, all operating at the individual, organizational, and even wider levels, all influencing whether that safety training actually translates into a safer workplace for people. It's way more complex than just thinking about the training course itself.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that framework, thinking about those three factors across those three levels, It gives you a really useful map, doesn't it? To understand the landscape in your own workplace. It highlights that successful training isn't an isolated event. It's completely embedded in everything else that's going on.
Right. So we've explored the why, the drivers for training, and the what, all these contextual factors creating the challenge. Did the study offer any thoughts on, practical steps or solutions? Where do we go from here?
It did touch on that. The framework itself is intended as a practical tool, actually.
How so? For diagnosis?
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
For you or your organization to systematically look at your own context and pinpoint where the potential roadblocks to training transfer might be. You could almost go through cell by cell on that matrix: technical, individual, technical, organizational, cultural, individual, and so on.
And then what? Target interventions.
That's the idea. So if you identify, say, a lack of technical skill in a specific area as a barrier for your team, maybe the answer isn't just more training, but perhaps better skills assessment beforehand, or more targeted coaching on the job afterwards.
Or if it's a cultural thing, like lack of manager support.
Then maybe you need leadership training focused on safety engagement or initiatives to build that psychological safety we talked about.
Yeah.
It prompts thinking beyond just tweaking the training module itself.
It really frames training as just one piece of a bigger safety puzzle, and you need all the pieces to fit together. Addressing these underlying context issues seems crucial for getting a real return on safety learning and, more importantly, actually improving safety outcomes for people.
Absolutely. And the study also raised a couple of pretty fundamental questions about the training itself.
Oh, yeah. What were those?
Well, first, is the training we're doing actually working? Is it effective?
How do you know if it's making a difference?
Exactly. The researchers pointed out that many organizations don't really have good ways to evaluate the real impact of their safety training. They might track attendance, maybe do a quiz at the end.
But not whether it changes behavior or prevents incidents back on the job.
Right. So companies could be pouring resources into programs that aren't actually delivering safer workplaces. There needs to be a much bigger focus on properly measuring effectiveness, understanding that return on investment in terms of actual safety improvement. How does your place measure training effectiveness? It's a tough question.
It really is. You need to know if the time and money spent are genuinely preventing harm. Okay, what was the second big question? You said it was even more fundamental.
Yeah, the second one was, is training even the right solution in the first place?
For the specific problem you're trying to solve.
Precisely. The trainers felt that training is often the default knee-jerk reaction to any safety concern. But sometimes the issue might be much better addressed higher up the hierarchy of controls.
Like through engineering, changing the physical environment.
Right.
Exactly. Or redesigning equipment, changing a work process. Things that eliminate or reduce the hazard itself, rather than just relying on people to follow a procedure learned in training. It's about stepping back, analyzing the root cause properly, and picking the most effective fix, not just automatically reaching for the training catalog.
So a more strategic, less reactive approach.
Yeah.
Really thinking, what's the best way to make this specific situation safer for people? Not just assuming training is the answer.
That's the challenge it poses.
The study also mentioned its own limitations, didn't it, and areas needing more research.
Yes, they were upfront about that. They noted their research mostly looked at traditional, often classroom-based training and its transfer.
Okay.
So they suggested future work could look more closely at learning that happens in the workplace, on-the-job training, informal learning, because that can sometimes unintentionally reinforce bad habits if it's not managed well.
Right. Learning the wrong way from colleagues. Could happen. They also flagged the massive rise in online safety training and the need to really understand what makes that transfer effectively into practice. Different challenges there.
Definitely. What else?
The role of the trainers themselves, their skills, their experience, how they adapt to context that needs more investigation. And finally, they suggested we need more dynamic studies.
Dynamic.
Yeah, looking at training transfer over a longer time period. Because the fit between training and context isn't static.
Right.
Workplaces change, people change. How does that evolution affect things?
Lots to explore still. It really underscores how complex making safety training stick actually is. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just bring it back to that core message from the study.
I think the main takeaway, really, for anyone listening, is that good safety training isn't just about good content or a charismatic trainer. Fundamentally, it's about alignment. It's about that fit.
Fit with the realities of the job.
Exactly. The technical realities, the cultural norms, the political currents, all happening at the individual level across the whole organization and even influenced by forces outside the organization entirely.
So maybe take a second now to think about safety training you've experienced or that your colleagues have. Did it really mesh with the daily grind, the complexities of your work?
Mhm.
Were there technical hurdles or cultural things, unspoken rules, or even those political dynamics we talked about that helped you use the training or maybe got in the way?
And this study really shone a light on those political factors, and especially the super-organizational ones, the stuff outside your company's walls that often get missed but can really shape how effective training is.
Right.
So maybe here's a final thought to chew on. What might be some of those less obvious political forces or external influences that are shaping safety behavior and training effectiveness right now in your industry or your specific field?
And could understanding those hidden dynamics maybe unlock a new way to get better safety outcomes for you and everyone you work with?
It's worth considering.
That is a powerful question to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into making workplace safety training actually stick. We really hope it's given you a fresh perspective on a vital topic.